In this video, we're going to talk about Greek independent and dependent clauses. Once again, the material is a condensation of what you're going to find in the reading from David Allen Black's grammar, put into a little bit more simplified terms. And I'm also going to give you a little chart to be able to identify different kinds of dependent clauses. So when we're talking about clauses, we're talking about two different categories of clauses: independent clauses and dependent clauses. Independent clauses stand on their own in a sentence. They don't need anything else to complete their meaning. So every sentence is going to have an independent clause. That is to say, it's going to have a subject and a verb. Sometimes the subject, as we have seen many times in Greek, will be embedded in the verb itself. That is to say, there won't be a separate word that tells us who is doing the action, but that person and number information is included in the verb itself. A dependent clause, in contrast, needs something else to complete its meaning. It doesn't stand on its own in a sentence. It cannot be a sentence itself because it needs something else to complete its meaning. That is to say, there is another main clause in the sentence to which a dependent clause is going to be subordinated, usually using a subordinating conjunction, of which there are a variety in Greek, which we talk about in a different video. So what I want you to do is to sort of get practice about identifying different kinds of clauses. I want you to see if you can identify the English independent clauses and the English dependent clauses in each sentence. So there's one of each, independent clause and a dependent clause in each sentence. And even if you feel like you're guessing at this point, that's okay. Making guesses is good for your learning. But here, doing some English grammar work, identifying which parts of the sentence can stand alone and which parts cannot stand alone. They depend on something else in the sentence to complete their meaning. All right, so here is each of these English sentences marked with their independent clauses all coming in the first part of the sentence and their dependent clauses all coming in the second part of the sentence marked in blue. And I should note that this is not always the case, that a dependent clause does not necessarily come second in a sentence. It can come earlier in a sentence. So I learned Greek well because, so everything after because is a causal clause telling us the reason that you learned Greek so well. So this part can stand on its own in a sentence. I learned Greek well. This part cannot stand on its own. Because I studied regularly in small amounts of time is not a complete sentence. It needs something else to complete its meaning, namely the independent clause over here. The same thing is going to be true here. I quickly learned Greek. That can be a sentence in itself. In order to use it for exegesis, cannot be a sentence in itself. It needs, this purpose clause needs this over here to complete its meaning. I learned Greek online, complete sentence, so that, or with the result that, or with the purpose that, so a purpose or result clause over here, I did not have to travel to Dubuque. I learned Greek, full stop, like a champion, comparative clause comparing the way you learned Greek to a champion. And then our go-to example here, Aaron Rodgers threw the ball to Davante Adams, as we know, can be a full sentence. And this temporal clause, when he was running down the field, tells us more about probably Davante Adams running down the field and not Aaron Rodgers running down the field, because our temporal clauses in English normally go with the subject or the person closest to them in a sentence. So this information, when he was running down the field, we need something else to finish the meaning there. It's a dependent clause that's dependent on this independent clause right here. So in Greek, we similarly have different kinds of independent clauses that are signaled by different words. So in English, we saw that these first words at the beginning of the clause tell us something about what is being communicated. That's going to also be the case in Greek, that the different kinds of clauses are going to be indicated by different Greek words. And so many of these you have seen and you've memorized as Greek words in your vocabulary, and you know how to translate them for that reason. But what they're really doing is signaling a dependent clause. So these are different conjunctions that are signaling different clauses. And what I've done in this next, I have not done it yet. In 2 slides from now, I've given you a chart of these plus conditional clauses, which we're going to talk about in the next slide, that sort of give you the type of clause with the word associated with it and the translation, so that you have a table to go to when looking for these clauses. In many cases, you won't necessarily need to go to that table because you already know the translation of these Greek words from memorizing them. You sort of naturally put the clause into its dependent relationship, but this gives you the language to talk about what kind of dependent clauses you have. And so the only kind of dependent clause that is not listed on this slide is a large class of dependent clauses called conditional clauses. So conditional clauses are a subclass of dependent clauses, and they have 2 parts to them: a protasis and an apodosis. The protasis is the if clause, and it normally comes first in a sentence, but it doesn't necessarily have to. And the apodosis is the then. So if this happens, then this happens. Conditional clauses are going to have both those parts, the if and the then. But the if and the then can function in different kinds of ways in Greek. That is, what is or might be the case, the if, what is the case or was the case, and then the result, are in different kinds of relationships to one another. And the reality behind both of these statements can be assumed in different kinds of ways. So there are technically 4 different classes of conditions. They're called 4 different conditional kinds of statements in Greek, but only 3 of them are common in the New Testament, so I'm not going to introduce the 4th one here. It's contained in Black's Grammar if you want to make reference to it. The first, and this is one of the 2 most common kinds of conditionals in the Greek New Testament, is what's called a first-class conditional. And in the protasis, that is the if clause, it's going to have a plus the indicative mood. And then in the apodosis, it will have any mood or tense. And when you see this a with the indicative mood and then whatever in the apodosis, what is being assumed here is that the if statement is assumed for the sake of argument. It may or may not be true. It could go either way. But for the sake of the argument, we are going to assume this is true. Then this will happen. So an example of this in English might be, if you complete all the specifications for the assignment, you will pass it. You may or may not complete the specifications for the assignment, but for the sake of the statement, for the sake of argument, let's presume that you do complete the specs. Then this is what will happen. The most rare, or the second most rare, I should say, the most rare is the 4th class conditional, not contained here. But of the 3 I'm going to list, the most rare is in the New Testament, is the 2nd class conditional, where you again have a, meaning if, in the first part, in the if clause, the protasis, but you have an aorist or imperfect tense and indicative mood verb with on and an accompanying aorist or imperfect in the apodosis. And what this assumes is that if something had happened, but it did not happen, then something else would have happened. So in 2nd class conditionals, what is in the if clause did not happen. But if it would have happened, if it actually would have occurred, then there would have been different results than there presently are. So let's say you did not complete the specifications for the last assignment. I would say something like, if you would have done the specifications, then you would have passed the assignment. Or if I tell my child, if you would have eaten all of your dinner, you would now be eating dessert. So the what is in the apodosis, it was not actually the case, but if it were the case, then there would have been a different result. And then the 3rd class conditional, which is about as common as the 1st class conditional in the New Testament, uses aeon or aeon pair with the subjunctive in the protasis and any mood or tense in the apodosis. And this assumes something that is sort of future oriented. It's possible. Remember, the subjunctive mood is the mood of possibility. So it's the third class conditional is assuming something will happen, and then as a result of that assumption, then something else will happen. So it's lunchtime right now. I'm telling my children, if you eat all of your dinner tonight, then you will have dessert. And I'm assuming that they will eat all of their dinner tonight. If I were not assuming, if it could go one way or another, then it would be a first class conditional. And in Greek, I would want to put it this way with the indicative mood. But if I did it, if I said it in Greek with aeon with the subjunctive, I would then be implying that they probably will eat their dinner, and as a result, they will get dessert. So different forms of the condition assume different kinds of things about what is or is not the case and what may or may not be the case in the if and the then clause respectively. So moving from conditionals back to dependent clauses generally, we have our whole list here of different kinds of dependent clauses in tabular form. So you can look to the key terms and the translation of these different conjunctions and the dependent clauses that they make. And so what I want to do here is identify three different dependent clauses and independent clauses in Greek sentences. So I would encourage you to do this both in Greek and in English. Underline or just identify on the screen here which part is the independent clause that doesn't depend on something else, what part is the dependent clause, and what is the word that is signaling that you have a dependent clause. So go ahead and pause here. I'm going to do the same, and again underline all the independents in one color and the dependents in another. All right, jumping back in here with our independent and dependent clauses. In the first two cases, we have the independent clause at the beginning. So you are blessed, makarioi este, both in English and in Greek, these can stand as complete sentences. They have a subject and an object. You are blessed. That can stand on its own. And then our temporal clause, right over here, is signaled by haton. So when they persecute you. When they persecute you cannot stand on its own. That when implies that something else needs to be there to make sense of this dependent clause. So this the dependent clause, and this the independent clause. Same thing with proseuxeste. In Greek, this could technically stand as a sentence in its own, a one-word sentence, insofar as our subject is included in the verb. You all pray. Here, an imperative command. So you all pray can be a sentence in and of itself. And then the dependent clause coming after it, a purpose clause, with the purpose that you do not fall into temptation, so that you do not fall into temptation. So that cannot stand on its own, so that you don't fall into temptation isn't a sentence in itself. It needs something else. It needs this independent clause, proseuxeste. And then lastly, we have the order flipped here. We didn't talk about this when we talked about conditionals, but conditionals technically have part a dependent clause and part an independent clause. The protasis, the if, is the dependent clause, and the apodosis, the then, is the independent clause. That part can stand on its own. So this part right here, cut it off and throw it from you, those commands can stand on their own. They make sense as a complete sentence. They contain a subject and an object, and they don't depend on anything else to make sense. Whereas the if statement, if your hand scandalizes you, needs something else. It begs for something else to complete the meaning. It's a dependent clause. And in this case, we have a conditional clause, and specifically a first class conditional. So notice in our if clause here, we have a plus the indicative. Scandalize is a present active indicative, third person singular. So we have a plus the indicative in the apodosis, or the protasis, and then we have aorist imperatives in the apodosis. So any mood or tense. So it doesn't really matter what our mood and tense is here, but the fact that we have a plus the indicative here tells us we have a first class conditional, which assumes for the sake of argument. So it may or may not be the case that your hand scandalizes you. But if it does, this is what you should do. Cut it off and throw it away.